Every father hopes his daughter will never know the touch of cruelty. Every child believes their parent will always be there to protect them. But in ancient Rome, when Emperor Aurelianus declares war on rebellion, families are torn apart and innocence becomes a weapon of conquest. Selene never imagined she would stand in chains before an entire town, her father's blood still fresh on Roman swords. The emperor's voice cuts through the crowd like steel. "Now you belong to me." What starts as public shame becomes something far more dangerous when this broken girl refuses to break completely. In a world where power rules everything, one young woman's defiance will shake the very foundations of an empire. But can innocence truly change a heart hardened by conquest? Or will Rome's hunger for control destroy them both? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The golden laurel crown weighed heavier than iron upon Aurelianus's brow as he stood before the marble window of his temporary quarters, watching the first pale light of dawn creep across the provincial town below. Sleep had abandoned him again, as it had for countless nights since he'd claimed the purple of empire. The crown, wrought from the finest gold and adorned with emeralds that caught the morning light, should have been a symbol of divine favor. Instead, it felt like a shackle binding him to choices that grew darker with each passing season. Below, in the narrow streets, the town of Tibur stirred to reluctant life. Shopkeepers emerged to arrange their wares with trembling hands, glancing nervously toward the imperial banners that hung from every corner. Children played in hushed whispers, their laughter muted by the presence of Roman soldiers who patrolled with hands resting on sword hilts. The very air seemed thick with fear, as if the stones themselves remembered the violence that had swept through these streets only days before. Aurelianus had not always been this man. There had been a time when he could walk among his people without seeing terror in their eyes, when his presence brought hope rather than dread. But that was before the weight of empire had taught him that mercy was a luxury emperors could not afford. Every act of compassion invited rebellion. Every moment of weakness encouraged those who would see Rome burn. Or so he told himself in the dark hours when conscience whispered accusations he dared not acknowledge. The rebellion of Marcus had begun like so many others, with grievances both reasonable and passionate. The chieftain had been a man of education and eloquence, schooled in both Latin and the ancient ways of his people. His arguments against Roman taxation had been measured, his requests for provincial autonomy presented with dignity. Under different circumstances, Aurelianus might have found common ground with such a man. But circumstances had demanded an example, and examples required blood. Marcus had gathered followers not through promises of easy victory, but through appeals to justice. He spoke of children sold into slavery to pay imperial taxes, of fertile lands seized for Roman veterans while local families starved. His words carried the weight of truth, which made them all the more dangerous. Truth had a way of spreading like wildfire, consuming the careful structures of order that held the empire together. The suppression had been swift and brutal. General Cassius, loyal as iron and twice as hard, had led 3 legions against the rebels with methodical efficiency. There had been no glory in it, just the grinding necessity of maintaining imperial authority. Marcus himself had died, sword in hand, defending a position he must have known was hopeless. His final stand had been witnessed by dozens of survivors, who spoke of how he had faced death with dignity, calling out words of love to a daughter he would never see. Again, that daughter now sat in chains, in the room beneath Aurelianus's feet, Selene, even. Her name carried an ethereal quality that seemed to mock the harsh reality of her circumstances. She was perhaps 20 summers old, with dark hair that caught the light like polished bronze, and eyes that held depths the emperor found himself reluctant to plumb. In the moment of her capture, when Roman soldiers had dragged her from the ruins of her father's stronghold, she had looked at Aurelianus with an expression he had not encountered in years. Not fear, Not hatred, but a kind of profound disappointment, as if she had expected better from the world and from him. The emperor's inner circle moved through the marble halls like shadows, each carrying their own burdens and calculations. General Cassius approached duty with the weight of 30 campaigns behind him, his scarred face a map of Rome's victories written in flesh and blood. He had served 3 emperors before Aurelianus, and his loyalty was absolute, not to the man, but to the idea of Rome itself. Yet lately, the emperor had noticed something in his general's eyes, a flicker of doubt that spoke of a conscience not yet fully buried beneath military necessity. Senator Brutus represented a different kind of power entirely. Where Cassius embodied the sword of Rome, Brutus wielded its political cunning. His letters from the capital carried news of senatorial debates and popular mood, but also subtle threats wrapped in diplomatic language. The senator's ambitions were poorly concealed behind protestations of loyalty, and Aurelianus knew that his every action here would be weighed and measured by men in purple-striped togas who had never felt an enemy's blade against their throat. Then there was Livia, his sister, his conscience, his most trusted advisor and harshest critic. She alone could speak to him without ceremony, challenge his decisions without fear of retribution. Her arrival was expected within days, summoned by messages that spoke of imperial business, but truly carried a brother's need for someone who remembered him before the crown had changed everything. Livia would not approve of what he planned for the rebel's daughter, but Livia had never carried the weight of empire, had never felt the suffocating responsibility of holding together a world that seemed determined to tear itself apart. The town below told its own story of imperial rule. Roman engineering had brought order to chaos, straight roads carved through ancient pathways, aqueducts carrying fresh water to communities that had once depended on seasonal streams, markets where goods from across the empire mingled with local crafts. Yet beneath this veneer of civilization lay the tension that always existed between conqueror and conquered. Old Helena, the town's wise woman, had lived through 3 changes of imperial administration. Her gnarled hands had delivered babies who were now grey-haired elders, had closed the eyes of those who remembered when these lands belonged to tribal kings rather than Roman governors. She moved through the streets like a living memory, her presence both comforting and unsettling to those who sought her counsel. The soldiers left her alone, recognizing in her bent frame something that could not be conquered by force, the enduring spirit of a people who would survive long after individual empires had crumbled to dust. Young Titus represented the generation caught between worlds. Born under Roman rule but raised on stories of freedom, he worked in his family's forge with hands that longed to grip weapons rather than tools. His friendship with Selene had been forged in childhood games and deepened through shared dreams of a different future. When news of her capture had reached the town, his eyes had burned with the same fire that had consumed her father, a flame that no amount of imperial pressure could fully extinguish. Captain Maximus embodied the contradictions that plagued every Roman officer serving in the provinces. He was a professional soldier, trained to follow orders without question, yet blessed or cursed with a conscience that made him see the human cost of every command. His men respected him for his competence and fairness, but lately he had begun to question whether respect built on fear was worth maintaining. The sight of Selene in chains had affected him more than he cared to admit, stirring memories of a sister lost to barbarian raids years ago. The emperor's personal quarters reflected his complex relationship with power. Scrolls of Marcus Aurelius shared shelf space with tactical manuals, while maps of the empire covered walls adorned with artwork celebrating Roman victories. A silver cup held wine that tasted of nothing, drunk from habit rather than pleasure. The bed, draped in imperial purple, remained largely unused. Sleep brought dreams, and dreams brought memories of choices that could not be undone. In the room below, Selene sat in silence that spoke louder than any protest. She had been given a chamber that would have been considered luxurious by most standards, soft furnishings, ample food, even access to books and writing materials. But luxury could not disguise captivity, and comfort could not heal the wound of watching her father's blood soak into foreign soil. Her mother's silver pendant depicting the goddess Diana hung around her neck, a connection to family and faith that no Roman authority could sever. The emperor knew that what happened in the next few days would echo through history. Word of Marcus's rebellion and its suppression was already spreading through the provinces, carried by merchants and soldiers, slaves and senators. How he dealt with the rebel's daughter would send a message about the nature of Roman justice, the limits of imperial mercy, and the price of defying Caesar's will. Outside, the sun climbed higher, and the town prepared for another day under imperial rule. Market vendors arranged their wares, children attended their lessons, and life continued with the resilient persistence that had carried humanity through countless ages of conquest and change. But beneath the surface of normalcy, currents of tension flowed like underground rivers, waiting for the moment when they would break forth and reshape the landscape of power. The golden crown caught the light as Aurelianus turned from the window, its weight pressing down on thoughts that had grown heavy with the burden of absolute authority. In a few hours, he would face Selene again, would continue the careful campaign to break her spirit without destroying her body. It was necessary, he told himself. It was the price of peace, the cost of order, the unfortunate but unavoidable consequence of ruling an empire built on the graves of its enemies. But in the growing light of morning, as the town below stirred to life under the shadow of Roman eagles, even the emperor could not escape the whisper of doubt that asked whether some prices were too high to pay, whether some victories cost more than defeat, and whether a man could claim to rule the world if he had lost dominion over his own soul. The sun reached its zenith as the bronze horns sounded 3 times across Tibur, their harsh notes echoing off stone walls and terracotta rooftops. Every citizen knew the meaning of that call. Imperial justice was about to be dispensed in the town square. They came reluctantly, feet dragging against cobblestones, mothers clutching children close, elders leaning on walking sticks worn smooth by decades of use. The crowd gathered not from curiosity, but from compulsion, understanding that absence would be noted and possibly punished. Selene's mother's silver pendant pressed against her collarbone as the chains bit into her wrists. Each step toward the square sent the small disc bouncing against her chest, a rhythm that reminded her of her mother's heartbeat during childhood illnesses, when fever dreams had been. Soothed by gentle hands and whispered prayers to Diana, the pendant bore the image of the huntress goddess, protector of women and children, guardian of those who faced impossible odds. Selene had touched it countless times during her father's final battle, praying for divine intervention that had never come. The crowd parted like water before the approaching procession. Roman soldiers in burnished mail marched in perfect formation, their hobnailed boots striking the stones in unison. Centurions barked orders that echoed off the surrounding buildings, while standard-bearers held high the golden eagles that proclaimed imperial authority to every corner of the empire. At the center of this display of military might, Selene walked with her head high, despite the weight of iron shackles. Her simple woolen dress torn and stained, but her dignity intact. Emperor Aurelianus emerged from the administrative building like a figure from legend. His ceremonial armor caught the sunlight, each piece polished to mirror brightness. The purple cloak of imperial authority flowed behind him as he ascended the steps to the raised platform where provincial justice was traditionally dispensed. The golden laurel crown upon his brow marked him as the earthly representative of Jupiter himself, wielder of divine authority over life and death. The silence that fell over the assembled crowd was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the narrow streets and the distant cry of a child who did not yet understand the gravity of the moment. Hundreds of faces turned upward toward the platform, each person acutely aware that they were witnessing something that would be remembered and spoken of for generations to come. Citizens of Tibur, the emperor's voice carried clearly across the square, trained by years of addressing armies and senate assemblies. You have seen the cost of rebellion against imperial authority. Marcus the chieftain lies dead, his followers scattered, his stronghold reduced to ash and rubble. Yet mercy tempers justice, as it always has under Roman rule. Selene was forced to her knees at the center of the platform, the chains rattling as she struggled to maintain some semblance of dignity despite her position. The crowd below watched in horrified fascination as their emperor circled her like a predator examining prey. Some had known her since childhood, had watched her help tend the wounded after battles, had seen her carry food to families whose fathers had not returned from Marcus's final campaign. This girl is the daughter of rebellion, Aurelianus continued, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Born in defiance, raised in sedition, schooled in the arts of war against the peace that Rome has brought to these lands. By rights, she should share her father's fate. Swift death as payment for treason against Caesar. The emperor's hands moved to the shoulders of Selene's dress, his fingers finding the worn fabric that had been her mother's before her. The material was simple but clean, mended with careful stitches that spoke of pride maintained despite poverty. For a moment that stretched like eternity, Aurelianus paused, seeming to weigh his next action against some internal scale of necessity and conscience. Then, with deliberate slowness that emphasized his complete control over the moment, he tore the dress from her shoulders. The sound of rending fabric carried clearly in the stunned silence, followed by Selene's sharp intake of breath and the collective gasp of the watching crowd. The emperor's action was not driven by lust, but by something far more calculated, the absolute assertion of ownership. The demonstration that even the daughter of a respected enemy was now merely property of the Roman state. "Now you belong to me," the emperor declared, his voice cutting through the horrified silence like a blade. The words carried layers of meaning that chilled every witness to the bone. This was not merely about one girl's fate, but about the relationship between ruler and ruled, conqueror and conquered, the powerful and the powerless. Selene's response surprised everyone present, perhaps including herself. Instead of collapsing in shame or crying out in despair, she slowly raised her head and met the emperor's gaze directly. Her dark eyes held depths of pain and loss, but also something else, a core of strength that had not been broken by witnessing her father's death or enduring her own humiliation. The silver pendant caught the light as it swayed against her exposed skin. Diana's image, seeming to watch over her faithful daughter in this moment of ultimate trial. The crowd's reaction was a mixture of horror, pity, and impotent rage. Old Helena's weathered face was streaked with tears as she whispered prayers in the old tongue that predated Roman occupation. Young Titus clenched his fists until his knuckles went white, understanding for the first time the true cost of powerlessness. Mothers turned their children's faces away from the platform while fathers stood frozen, knowing that any move to intervene would bring death not just to themselves, but to their families. General Cassius, standing at attention behind his emperor, felt something twist in his chest at the sight of the girl's quiet courage. In 30 years of military service, he had seen countless displays of bravery on battlefields across the empire. But there was something different about this, a strength that required no sword or shield, that drew its power from sources he did not fully understand. His hand moved unconsciously toward his weapon's hilt, though whether to defend or attack he could not say. Senator Brutus observed the proceedings with the calculating gaze of a political animal. His mind was already composing the letters he would send to Rome, describing the scene in terms that would either praise the emperor's firm hand or condemn his excessive cruelty, depending on which version would better serve his own ambitions. The girl's defiance was noted and filed away as potentially useful information for future use. The emperor himself felt an unexpected flutter of uncertainty as he looked into Selene's eyes. He had expected tears, pleas for mercy, the broken spirit that usually followed such public humiliation. Instead, he found himself confronted by a gaze that seemed to see through his imperial trappings to something deeper, something he had thought long buried beneath the necessities of rule. For just a moment, her expression reminded him of another woman from his past, one whose memory he had spent years trying to forget. Captain Maximus, standing with his men at the platform's edge, found himself remembering his younger sister's face on the day barbarian raiders had carried her away. The mixture of terror and determination in her eyes had haunted his dreams for years, driving him to seek vengeance through military service. Now, seeing that same expression reflected in Selene's features, he felt old wounds tear open and bleed afresh. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable, broken finally by the Emperor's voice, quieter now, but no less commanding. "Take her to the administrative building. She will remain there under guard until I decide her final fate." The words carried a finality that left no room for argument or appeal. As the soldiers moved to escort Selene from the platform, she spoke for the first time since her capture. Her voice was clear and strong, carrying across the square despite her exposed and vulnerable position. "My father died free. That is more than you can say, Caesar." The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs at her audacity, while several soldiers reached for their weapons. But Aurelianus raised a hand, stopping any immediate retaliation. His eyes never left Selene's face as she was led away, her head still high, her spirit apparently unbroken despite everything she had endured. The assembly dispersed slowly, reluctantly, each person carrying with them the image of what they had witnessed. In the days to come, they would speak of it in whispers, behind closed doors, in the careful language that the oppressed use when the oppressor's ears are always listening. But they would speak of it and remember, and pass the memory on to their children, like a seed that would one day grow into something the emperor could not have anticipated. As the square emptied and afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Aurelianus remained on the platform, staring at the spot where Selene had knelt. The golden crown felt heavier than ever upon his brow, and for the first time in years he found himself questioning whether absolute power was worth the absolute isolation it demanded. The heavy iron shackles around Selene's wrists had rubbed her skin raw during the long hours since her public humiliation. Now, as evening shadows crept across the marble floor of her prison chamber, she sat in silence, refusing to acknowledge the luxury that surrounded her captivity. Persian carpets covered cold stone, bronze braziers filled the air with warmth and the scent of expensive oils, and a table laden with delicacies sat untouched near the barred window. None of it could disguise the fundamental truth. She was a caged bird. No matter how gilded the cage, the emperor had visited twice since the afternoon's events, each time attempting to engage her in conversation that might lead to submission. His first approach had been philosophical, quoting Marcus Aurelius on the nature of duty and the greater good. "Even a rebel's daughter must understand that individual suffering serves the broader cause of peace," he had said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man accustomed to having his words treated as law. Selene had responded with the weapon that seemed to disturb him most: complete silence. She neither looked at him nor acknowledged his presence, treating the Emperor of Rome as if he were merely another piece of furniture in the ornate chamber. Her stillness was not passive but active, a deliberate choice that required more strength than any dramatic gesture of defiance. The second visit had revealed more of the man beneath the crown. Aurelianus had brought with him a leather-bound volume of philosophical writings, its pages worn smooth by countless readings. He placed it on the table beside the untouched food, his movements betraying an uncertainty that sat strangely on shoulders accustomed to bearing imperial authority. "Your father was educated," he said, settling into a chair across from where she sat on the sleeping couch. "Marcus could quote Plato in perfect Latin, debate the merits of Stoic philosophy with any senator in Rome. Intelligence runs in your bloodline. It would be a waste to let it perish through stubborn pride." Still, Selene maintained her silence, though something flickered in her dark eyes at the mention of her father's learning. Marcus had indeed been a scholar as well as a warrior, teaching her to read in 3 languages and filling their modest home with scrolls copied from great libraries. The emperor's words carried an unintended cruelty. They reminded her of everything she had lost, of conversations that would never resume, and lessons that would never be completed. "I have read the same texts that shaped your father's mind," Aurelianus continued, opening the book to a marked passage. "Marcus Aurelius writes that we suffer more in imagination than reality. Your current circumstances need not define your future, girl. Cooperation could lead to a very different fate than the one you seem determined to embrace." The emperor's philosophy rang hollow in Selene's ears, filtered as it was through lips that had ordered her father's death and hands that had torn her dress before hundreds of witnesses. She understood the game he was playing, the careful balance between punishment and reward, the gradual breaking down of resistance through isolation and false kindness. Her father had warned her about such tactics, describing how Roman diplomats would offer friendship with one hand while holding a dagger behind their back. Outside the chamber, General Cassius paced the marble corridor with the restless energy of a caged predator. His scarred face bore the weathered lines of a man who had seen too much violence, yet something about the afternoon's events had unsettled him in ways that decades of warfare had not. The image of the girl meeting the emperor's gaze without flinching had lodged itself in his memory like a splinter, impossible to ignore or remove. "The men are talking," he said when Aurelianus finally emerged from Selene's chamber, the unread book still clutched in his hands. "They've never seen anything like what happened today. Some are calling her brave, others think she's mad. All of them are wondering what comes next." The emperor's jaw tightened at this report. An army's morale was a delicate thing, built on respect for authority and confidence in leadership. If his soldiers began to see defiance as admirable rather than dangerous, the consequences could spread far beyond this provincial town. "What do you recommend, General?" Cassius had served under 3 emperors, each with their own approach to maintaining discipline and loyalty. With the first, he had learned that fear could motivate but never inspire. With the second, he had discovered that respect earned through competence lasted longer than respect demanded through rank. With Aurelianus, he was still learning, still trying to understand the complex mixture of philosophy and pragmatism that drove his current master. "The girl is becoming a symbol," he said carefully, aware that honest counsel was not always welcome from subordinates. "Symbols can be dangerous if they represent the wrong ideals. Perhaps it would be better to end this quickly, before her defiance has time to take root in other minds." The suggestion hung in the air between them, cold and practical as a blade. Aurelianus considered it, weighing the political wisdom against something else, a reluctance he could not quite name or understand. The rational choice was clear: eliminate a potential source of future rebellion before it could spread. Yet something about Selene's unwavering gaze had awakened memories he had spent years trying to bury. In the town below, word of the day's events spread through whispered conversations and meaningful glances. Old Helena moved through the narrow streets like a living repository of memory, her presence offering comfort to those who needed to believe that some things endured beyond the reach of imperial power. Children who had witnessed the public humiliation asked their parents questions that had no easy answers, while merchants calculated whether continued resistance would cost them more than submission. Young Titus worked late in his family's forge, the rhythmic hammer blows against heated iron, providing an outlet for rage he could not safely express in words. Each strike of the hammer was a blow he longed to deliver against Roman authority, each shower of sparks a reminder of the fire that still burned in hearts that refused to be conquered. His friends gathered around the forge as darkness fell, their faces illuminated by the red glow of coals and the shared knowledge that something fundamental had changed in their world. Captain Maximus found himself unable to focus on routine duties. his thoughts returning again and again to the moment when Selene had lifted her head and met the Emperor's gaze. Something in her expression had reminded him of his lost sister, but also of something larger, the indomitable human spirit that no amount of force could completely destroy. He walked the walls of the administrative building, ostensibly checking on guard rotations, but actually struggling with questions that had no clear answers. The night wore on, marked by the changing of the guard and the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere in the darkness. In her chamber, Selene finally moved from her position on the couch, walking to the window where moonlight filtered through iron bars. The silver pendant around her neck caught the pale light, Diana's image seeming to watch over her faithful daughter in this moment of solitude and reflection. For the first time since her capture, she spoke aloud, her voice barely audible in the silence of the chamber. "Give me strength, blessed Diana. Help me honor my father's memory and my people's hope." The prayer was simple but heartfelt, a connection to something larger than herself that no earthly power could sever. The iron shackles remained heavy on her wrists, but somehow they felt less burdensome than before. The scroll of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations lay open on Aurelianus's private desk, its parchment yellowed with age and handling. The emperor's fingers traced the familiar lines of text, as if seeking comfort in philosophy that had once provided answers to life's complexities. "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy," he read aloud to the empty chamber, his voice hollow with doubt. The irony was not lost on him. Here he sat, seeking wisdom from a dead philosopher, while holding captive a girl whose only crime was loving a father who had dared to dream of freedom. The sound of sandaled feet in the corridor announced an arrival that Aurelianus both anticipated and dreaded. Livia entered without ceremony, as was her privilege as imperial sister, and one of the few people who remembered him before the crown had changed everything. Her travel-stained cloak spoke of hard riding from Rome. Urgent haste that suggested more than routine imperial business had drawn her to this provincial backwater. "Brother," she said, settling into a chair without invitation or preamble. Livia had inherited the same dark eyes and strong jaw that marked their bloodline, but where Aurelianus's features had hardened into the mask of absolute authority, hers retained the warmth of someone who still saw individuals rather than subjects in the faces around her. "You received my message quickly," he replied, closing the scroll with deliberate care. Their childhood had been spent in a world where words carried hidden meanings and casual conversations could conceal deadly intentions. Even now, with only family present, both siblings measured their speech with the caution of those who understood that power made enemies of friends and strangers of blood relations. Word travels faster than imperial messengers when it concerns the emperor's unusual methods of maintaining order. Livia's tone carried the particular blend of affection and exasperation that only siblings could master. "The Senate is asking questions, Aurelianus. Uncomfortable questions about your handling of provincial rebellions and your treatment of prisoners." The emperor's jaw tightened at the mention of senatorial scrutiny. Rome's governing body remained a force to be reckoned with, despite the concentration of power in imperial hands. Senators could not remove an emperor directly, but they could make his reign sufficiently miserable to encourage abdication or worse. "Senator Brutus has been busy with his correspondence. I assume Brutus is a serpent, as we both know, but even serpents sometimes speak truth when it serves their purpose." Livia rose and moved to the window that overlooked the town square where the afternoon's drama had unfolded. "Tell me about the girl, brother. Tell me why the daughter of a dead rebel has captured your attention so completely that you risk your political standing to keep her alive." The question struck deeper than Aurelianus had expected. Touching on motivations, he had not fully examined himself. Why had he not simply ordered Selene's execution alongside her father's? The practical answer was that living symbols could be more useful than dead martyrs. But even as he formulated the response, he knew it rang false. "She reminds me of someone," he said finally, the admission surprising them both with its honesty. There's something in her eyes, a strength that refuses to bend despite everything she's endured. I had thought such spirits were extinct in our age of compromise and calculated submission. Livia turned from the window, her expression thoughtful. She had known her brother through 3 decades of life, had watched him transform from an idealistic young man into the calculating ruler who now bore the weight of empire. Who does she remind you of, Aurelianus? Who from our past carries such power over your present choices? The emperor's silence stretched long enough to become an answer in itself. There had been a woman once, before the crown and its responsibilities had consumed everything else in his life. Helena, not the old wise woman of Tibur, but another Helena whose memory he had tried to bury beneath years of duty and necessity. She had possessed the same unwavering spirit, the same refusal to submit to authority simply because it demanded submission. Her death had been a political necessity, ordered by the previous emperor for reasons of state that had seemed logical at the time. Aurelianus had carried out that order personally, believing it would prove his loyalty and dedication to Rome's greater good. In the administrative building's lower chambers, Captain Maximus struggled with his own crisis of conscience. The emperor's orders had been clear: guard the prisoner, ensure her comfort within reasonable limits, and report any attempts at escape or communication with outside contacts. What the orders had not addressed was how to maintain professional distance from someone whose courage had awakened memories better left undisturbed. Selene had spoken to him only once since her confinement, asking not for freedom or mercy, but for word about the town's children who had been present during her father's final battle. Her concern for others in the midst of her own suffering had struck him as profoundly foreign to his experience of prisoners and captives. Most begged for their lives or raged against their fate. Few worried about the welfare of those they had left behind. The boy with the twisted leg, Gaius, did he escape the fighting? She had asked, her voice carrying genuine concern, despite the iron shackles that marked her as property of the Roman state. He was helping carry wounded men from the battlefield when I last saw him. Maximus had found himself providing reassurance rather than maintaining the cold distance expected of a professional soldier. The boy is safe. His family's home was spared during the suppression. He's been helping old Helena tend to the injured. The relief in Selene's eyes had been immediate and profound, as if the welfare of a lame child mattered more to her than her own uncertain fate. Such selflessness was rare in Maximus's experience, particularly among those facing their own mortality. It spoke to a character that had been shaped by something beyond mere rebellion or political grievance. General Cassius's evening reports painted a picture of growing unrest throughout the region. Marcus's rebellion had been suppressed, but the underlying causes remained unaddressed. Heavy taxation continued to drive families into debt and desperation. Roman veterans settled on confiscated lands, while displaced locals struggled to survive on marginal holdings. The sight of their chieftain's daughter in chains had crystallized resentments that had been simmering for years. 3 more villages have reported missing tax collectors, Cassius informed his emperor, his weathered face grim with professional concern. The local magistrates believe these men have been killed rather than simply driven off. If that's true, we're facing the beginning of a broader uprising. Aurelianus absorbed this information with the practiced calm of a ruler accustomed to managing multiple crises simultaneously. Yet beneath his imperial composure, doubts continued to gnaw at his confidence. Every act of force seemed to generate 2 acts of resistance. Every demonstration of power created new enemies, while failing to secure the loyalty of existing subjects. In her chamber, Selene had discovered the philosophical texts the emperor had left behind. Despite herself, she found comfort in words written by men who had struggled with questions of duty, justice, and the proper response to suffering. Marcus Aurelius had been an emperor, yet his writings spoke to universal human experiences that transcended rank and political position. Accept the things to which fate binds you, "And love the people with whom fate associates you," she read aloud, her voice soft in the candle-lit chamber. The words carried new meaning when viewed through the lens of her current circumstances. Perhaps acceptance did not require submission. Just as love did not require approval of another's actions, the scroll felt warm in her hands, as if the wisdom it contained could provide actual comfort rather than mere intellectual satisfaction. For the first time since her capture, Selene allowed herself to consider possibilities beyond immediate survival. What if her captivity served some larger purpose? What if her father's death had meaning that extended beyond the simple mathematics of rebellion and suppression? The night deepened around Tibur, bringing with it the kind of silence that amplified both thought and doubt. The simple iron band around Selene's finger felt warm against her skin as she closed her eyes and remembered her father's hands. Marcus had worn this ring for 20 years, through battles and negotiations, feast days and famines. Now it rested on her smallest finger, smuggled to her by old Helena through a network of sympathizers who moved through Tibur like shadows, carrying hope in their careful whispers and small acts of defiance. Helena had appeared in the pre-dawn darkness, a gnarled form somehow bypassing the Roman guards who patrolled the administrative building. The old woman's presence in Selene's chamber had seemed as natural as sunrise, as if locked doors and imperial authority were merely temporary inconveniences that wisdom and determination could overcome. "Your father wanted you to have this," Helena had whispered, pressing the ring into Selene's palm with hands that trembled from age, but not fear. "He spoke of you in his final moments, child, not with sorrow for what you would endure, but with pride for what you would become." The ring carried more than sentimental value. It bore the seal of Marcus's authority as elected chieftain, a symbol of legitimacy that some might still recognize and follow. Its presence on Selene's finger transformed her from mere prisoner to living reminder of a cause that death had not defeated. The weight of that responsibility pressed against her heart like a physical burden, yet also provided strength she had not known she possessed. The Emperor's discovery of the underground resistance had been swift and brutal. Dawn brought the sound of hobnailed boots on cobblestones as Roman soldiers swept through the town, kicking down doors and dragging suspected sympathizers from their homes. The methodology was familiar from countless other provincial uprisings. Arrest first, investigate later, and let fear do the work that evidence might not support. Young Titus found himself among the first taken, his friendship with Selene and his family's prominence in the local metalworking trade making him an obvious target for suspicion. The soldiers who bound his hands showed the casual efficiency of men accustomed to such work, neither cruel nor gentle, but simply professional in their application of imperial will. "This one was seen talking to the prisoner's guard yesterday," reported the centurion responsible for the sweep, his voice carrying the flat tones of a man making routine observations. Multiple witnesses place him near the administrative building during times when he had no legitimate business there. Emperor Aurelianus received these reports in his temporary throne room, a commandeered chamber that had been hastily decorated with imperial symbols and Roman standards. The irony was not lost on him that he now sat in judgment over a rebellion whose causes he increasingly understood, even as duty demanded its complete suppression. "Bring the boy," he ordered, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, despite the doubts that had begun to cloud his judgment. Titus was young enough to break under pressure, old enough to possess useful information, and expendable enough that his fate could serve as an example to others who might consider resistance. The interrogation that followed revealed the complex loyalties that bound small communities together in ways that Roman law had never fully comprehended. Titus admitted to carrying messages but claimed ignorance of their contents. He acknowledged friendship with the prisoner, but denied any organized conspiracy against imperial authority. His answers carried the ring of truth mixed with careful omissions that suggested intelligence behind his youthful appearance. "You understand the penalty for treason," Aurelianus said, studying the young man's face for signs of fear that might indicate weakness to exploit. "Your life is forfeit, along with those of your family and anyone else who aided in this conspiracy. Unless, of course, cooperation earns you the mercy that defiance cannot." Captain Maximus watched these proceedings from his position near the chamber's entrance, his hand resting on his sword hilt, more from habit than any expectation of violence. The Emperor's interrogation techniques were methodical and professional, designed to extract maximum information with minimum resistance. Yet something about the boy's quiet dignity reminded him of Selene's own refusal to be broken by circumstances beyond her control. The breakthrough came not through torture or threats, but through an unexpected moment of honesty that caught everyone present by surprise. When asked directly about his motivations for risking Roman punishment, Titus abandoned evasion and spoke with the passionate clarity of youth confronting injustice. "She gives us hope," he said, his voice carrying across the chamber with surprising strength. "Not hope for victory, because we know the legions are too strong. Hope that someone can face the worst you can do and still refuse to surrender what matters most. That's worth more than safety, Caesar. That's worth more than life itself." The words hung in the air like an indictment, challenging the emperor's assumption that fear and force could solve every problem that threatened imperial stability. Aurelianus found himself seeing his own actions through different eyes, not as necessary measures to maintain order, but as symptoms of a system that created the very problems it claimed to solve. General Cassius observed his emperor's reaction with the trained eye of a soldier who had learned to read battlefield conditions. In the faces of his commanders, something fundamental was shifting in Aurelianus's approach to this crisis, a movement away from pure pragmatism towards something more complex and potentially dangerous. The general's loyalty remained absolute, but his concern for his emperor's political survival grew with each passing hour. In Rome, Senator Brutus received detailed reports of these events through his network of informants and allies. The emperor's handling of a simple provincial rebellion was providing exactly the kind of political ammunition that ambitious senators needed to justify their own bids for power. Each act of unexpected mercy could be painted as weakness, while every display of force could be condemned as unnecessary cruelty. The poisoned chalice arrived that evening, delivered by a courier who claimed to carry greetings from loyal senators in the capital. The goblet itself was a work of art, silver inlaid with gold, decorated with images of Jupiter dispensing justice to mortals below. Only the most careful examination revealed the subtle discoloration around the rim that suggested something more sinister than ceremonial wine. Aurelianus held the cup in hands that remained steady despite the implications of its arrival. Political assassination was nothing new in Roman history, but the timing of this particular threat carried special significance. Someone in the capital wanted him to understand that his actions in Tibur were being watched, judged, and found wanting by those who possessed the power to act on their displeasure. "A gift from Rome," he said to Livia, setting the chalice on his desk with deliberate care. "It seems my methods of governance have attracted attention from unexpected quarters." His sister examined the goblet with the eye of someone who had survived 3 decades in the imperial court, where survival often depended on recognizing threats before they became fatal. "Brutus?" she asked, though her tone suggested the answer was already known. Possibly, probably, though. It hardly matters who sent it. The message is clear. Enough. Aurelianus moved to the window that had become his preferred vantage point for observing the town below. "Continue as you are and face the consequences. Change course and appear weak. The classic trap that has destroyed emperors far more capable than myself." The evening brought no easy answers, only the growing certainty that every choice carried consequences that extended far beyond the walls of this provincial town. The poisoned chalice sat on Emperor Aurelianus's desk like a silver monument to treachery, its ornate surface reflecting the flickering candlelight that illuminated his private chambers through the darkest hours before dawn. Senator Brutus's agents had been busy in Rome, weaving narratives that painted the emperor as either dangerously weak or unnecessarily cruel, depending on which version better served their master's ambitions. The cup represented more than assassination. It was a political chess move designed to corner an emperor who had forgotten that absolute power was always temporary in the eternal city. News of provincial uprisings had begun reaching Tibur through the efficient network of Roman roads and military dispatches. Marcus's rebellion had not died with its leader, but had instead inspired similar movements across 3 provinces, each drawing strength from the story of a chieftain's daughter who refused to bow before imperial authority. The girl in chains had become something far more dangerous than her. Captors had anticipated a living symbol of resistance that inspired others to risk everything for the possibility of freedom. Selene's influence on Captain Maximus had grown beyond the professional relationship between guard and prisoner into something that threatened the foundations of his military discipline. The captain found himself listening to her observations about justice and mercy with the attention usually reserved for senior officers, seeking her opinion on matters of conscience that had never troubled him during 20 years of faithful service to Rome. Your emperor quotes philosophers, she had said during one of their carefully supervised conversations, but he seems to have forgotten that wisdom without compassion becomes mere cleverness. Marcus Aurelius wrote about duty to the common good, not duty to personal power. These words haunted Maximus as he walked his rounds, observing the faces of townspeople who no longer met Roman eyes with the automatic deference that had once marked conquered peoples. Something fundamental had shifted in the relationship between ruler and ruled, a change that could not be reversed through additional force or more severe punishments. Livia's investigation into her brother's past had led her to uncomfortable truths about the price of imperial ambition. In dusty archives and whispered conversations with aging servants, she had uncovered the story of Helena, the other Helena, whose death had marked the beginning of Aurelianus's transformation from idealistic prince to calculating emperor. The woman had been executed for treason, her crime nothing more than refusing to abandon her principles when political convenience demanded compromise. You killed her yourself, Livia said, confronting her brother in the pre-dawn hours when guards were distant and conversations could remain private. Helena died by your hand because the previous emperor wanted proof of your loyalty. You've carried that guilt for 15 years. And now this girl reminds you of what you lost when you chose power over love. The emperor's silence confirmed what his sister had already suspected. The philosophical text, the attempts at conversation, the reluctance to simply order Selene's execution, all of it stemmed from a wounded conscience that had found in a rebel's daughter the echo of a woman whose memory had never truly died. General Cassius's loyalty faced its greatest test as he witnessed his emperor's growing instability. Orders became contradictory. Decisions wavered between excessive mercy and brutal severity. And the clear strategic thinking that had characterized Aurelianus's reign began to fracture under the weight of personal demons long suppressed. The general's duty was absolute, but his concern for Rome itself began to outweigh his devotion to any individual ruler. The men are talking, he reported during their daily briefing, his scarred face grave with professional concern. Not openly, not seditiously, but they're questioning orders that seem to serve no military purpose. When soldiers begin to doubt their commander's judgment, discipline follows doubt into destruction. In the streets of Tibur, the townspeople displayed a growing boldness that manifested in small but significant acts of defiance. Shopkeepers who had once scrambled to serve Roman customers now served them last, after attending to local needs. Children who had hidden when patrols passed now watched openly, their young faces reflecting a mixture of curiosity and contempt that spoke to generational change. Even old Helena moved more freely, her gnarled form no longer bent with the submissive posture of the conquered but straightened with the dignity of someone who had lived to see the tide beginning to turn. The philosophical debate between Selene and Aurelianus had evolved from interrogation to something approaching discourse between equals. The emperor found himself defending positions he had once held with absolute certainty, explaining decisions that increasingly seemed to require justification rather than simple acceptance. Her questions cut to the heart of imperial authority itself, challenging not just his actions, but the entire system that gave those actions legitimacy. "You speak of order as if chaos were the only alternative," she said during one of their evening conversations, her voice carrying the measured tones of someone who had inherited her father's gift for rhetoric. "But what is order that requires constant violence to maintain? What is peace that can only exist when hope has been killed? Your empire rules through fear, and fear creates the very rebellions you claim to prevent." These words struck deeper than any weapon could have reached, touching on doubts that had grown stronger with each passing year of his reign. Aurelianus had begun to see the circular nature of imperial logic. Rebellion justified suppression, which created conditions for more rebellion, requiring ever greater force to maintain a peace that seemed always to slip further from reach. The revelation that came through Helena's cryptic warnings arrived like lightning, illuminating a landscape previously hidden in darkness. The old woman's mysterious knowledge of imperial history extended beyond local folklore into secrets that could destroy dynasties. Her references to sins that echo through generations and justice that waits for the appointed hour carried implications that made the emperor's blood run cold with recognition. "Know who you really are," she had whispered to him during a chance encounter in the administrative building's corridors. "I know how you came to wear that crown, and I know the price that was paid for the throne you call legitimate. The gods have long memories, Caesar, and their justice moves slowly but arrives inevitably. The emperor's first love had indeed died because of his earlier acts of political necessity, but Helena's words suggested connections and consequences that extended far beyond personal tragedy into the realm of dynastic legitimacy itself. The woman whose death had haunted his dreams had been more than a romantic attachment. She had been a witness to crimes that could shake the foundations of his authority. If they ever came to light, as night deepened over Tibur, Aurelianus found himself confronting the possibility that his captive possessed more power to destroy him than he had ever imagined, and that the game being played in this provincial town had stakes that reached all the way to the imperial throne itself. The poisoned chalice on his desk had become a symbol not just of external threats, but of a reckoning that had been building for years and could no longer be avoided through force or political maneuvering. The hidden letter lay folded within the pages of an ancient medical text, its parchment yellow with age, and its seal bearing the imperial eagle of the previous emperor. Old Helena's weathered hands trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of secrets, carried for 15 years, as she revealed the document that would change everything about the conflict raging in Tibur. The revelation came in the pre-dawn darkness of Selene's chamber, where the old woman had appeared like a ghost from the past, carrying truths that could topple dynasties. "I was more than wise woman to your people. A child," Helena whispered, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had served in the highest circles of power before choosing exile and silence. "I'd nursed the man who now calls himself emperor, watched him grow from innocent babe to the monster who murdered his way to the throne. This letter proves what I witnessed. Aurelianus is not Caesar's legitimate heir, but a usurper who gained power through poison and lies." Selene's world tilted on its axis as she absorbed the implications of Helena's words. The document before her, written in the careful script of imperial secretaries, outlined Emperor Claudius Maxentius's final decree, a revolutionary proclamation that would have granted autonomy to the provinces, including her homeland, and established a new form of governance based on consent rather than conquest. The decree had been completed mere hours before the emperor's sudden death from what court physicians had diagnosed as a weak heart. Claudius was going to free us, Selene breathed, her fingers tracing the elegant Latin phrases that spelled out a vision of the future her father had died fighting to achieve. He was going to end the cycle of rebellion and suppression by addressing its causes rather than simply crushing its symptoms. Helena nodded, her ancient eyes bright with tears that had waited years to fall. The old emperor knew that Rome's greatest strength lay not in the fear it inspired, but in the loyalty it earned. He planned to announce this decree at the next session of the Senate, to transform the empire from a tyranny into a confederation of willing allies. But Aurelianus saw only weakness where his predecessor saw wisdom. The method of assassination had been as clever as it was cruel. Aurelianus had served as Claudius's food taster, a position of ultimate trust that provided perfect opportunity for treachery. A slow-acting poison, administered over weeks through carefully prepared delicacies, had created the appearance of natural death while eliminating the only obstacle to traditional imperial ambitions. The crime had been witnessed by Helena, then serving as palace herb woman, whose medical knowledge allowed her to recognize symptoms that others had missed. I tried to warn him, the old woman continued, her voice heavy with the guilt of survival. But who listens to warnings from aging servants when power is within reach? I fled Rome that very night, carrying this letter and the knowledge that would have meant my death if discovered. For 15 years, I've waited for the right moment, the right person, to reveal what I know. The letter transformed everything about Selene's understanding of her father's rebellion and her own imprisonment. Marcus had not been a traitor fighting against legitimate authority. He had been a patriot, seeking to restore the rightful government that assassination had prevented. His death became not the price of sedition, but the cost of seeking justice in a world where justice had been murdered along with its greatest champion, Emperor Aurelianus's. Discovery of Helena's betrayal came through his network of informants, servants whose loyalty had been purchased through a mixture of gold and fear. The news struck him like a physical blow, shattering the careful mental constructions that had allowed him to justify 15 years of increasingly brutal rule. The old woman who had nursed him through childhood illnesses had become the instrument of his potential destruction. His rage manifested not in the calculated fury of imperial displeasure, but in the desperate violence of a trapped animal, lashing out at everything within reach. Orders flew from his chambers like arrows from a bow. Helena was to be arrested immediately, her associates identified and detained. Anyone who had spoken with her in recent days brought in for questioning. The systematic suppression that followed swept up innocent and guilty, alike in a web of suspicion that threatened to tear the town apart. Livia's horror at learning the truth about her brother's rise to power was complete and devastating. She had suspected political maneuvering, perhaps some ethical compromises necessary to secure succession in a dangerous time. But premeditated murder of a reforming emperor who had trusted Aurelianus like a son struck at the core of everything she had believed about family honor and imperial legitimacy. "You killed Claudius," she said, confronting her brother in his chambers as dawn broke over a town now under martial law. "You murdered the best emperor Rome has known in generations because he threatened your ambitions with his wisdom. Everything we have built, everything we have sacrificed for, rests on the foundation of that crime." The confrontation that followed revealed the full extent of Aurelianus's psychological deterioration. Faced with the collapse of every justification he had constructed for his actions, the emperor's carefully maintained composure cracked like ice under pressure. His attempts to defend the assassination revealed not reasoned political calculation, but the desperate rationalizations of a man who had sold his soul for power and spent years trying to convince himself the price had been worth paying. General Cassius's moral awakening came with the force of divine revelation as he realized he had spent his career serving not the legitimate heir to Roman glory, but a murderer whose very presence on the throne made every order, suspect and every victory hollow. The general's absolute loyalty had been built on the assumption that he served the rightful emperor of Rome. Remove that foundation, and the entire structure of his professional life collapsed into rubble. Captain Maximus's decision to aid Selene's cause crystallized in the moment he understood that his duty to Rome itself required defying the man who had stolen Rome's throne. The young woman in chains represented not rebellion against legitimate authority, but resistance to usurpation, making her the truest Roman in a province ruled by a criminal wearing imperial purple. Senator Brutus's arrival in Tibur with this knowledge transformed the political landscape entirely. The ambitious senator had come seeking to exploit the emperor's handling of provincial rebellion for personal gain. But the revelation of Aurelianus's crimes provided opportunities far beyond mere political advantage. Here was the weapon that could destroy an emperor and clear the path for new leadership in Rome itself. The letter's contents spread through the town like fire through dry grass, carried by whispers that grew bolder with each telling. The revelation that their resistance had been justified not just by conscience, but by law itself, transformed the relationship between occupier and occupied. Romans and locals alike found themselves questioning everything they had accepted about authority, legitimacy, and the price of peace. Selene's transformation from victim to potential liberator was as sudden as it was complete. The girl who'd been dragged in chains before a jeering crowd now held in her hands the power to expose truth that could shake the empire to its foundations. The knowledge changed not just her circumstances, but her understanding of her role in the larger drama unfolding around them. The psychological impact on Aurelianus was catastrophic and immediate. Every philosophical justification for his actions crumbled in the face of this ultimate revelation. The Stoic principles he had quoted, the appeals to necessity and the greater good, the careful construction of imperial duty, all of it became meaningless when built on the foundation of fundamental illegitimacy. As night fell over Tibur, the emperor, who had claimed divine authority, found himself confronting the possibility that he was nothing more than a common criminal who had stolen the purple and spent 15 years trying to make the theft seem legitimate. The girl he had sought to break had instead become the instrument of his own destruction, carrying in her small hands the power to topple the throne he had killed to claim. The Roman eagle standard gleamed in the torchlight as Emperor Aurelianus gripped its golden shaft, with hands that trembled not from age, but from the magnitude of the choice that lay before him. The sacred symbol of imperial authority had been carried into battle by legions across 3 continents, had stood witness to victories that built an empire and defeats that tested its resolve. Now it represented the ultimate test of character. Whether a man who had stolen power through murder could find the courage to defend it through more violence or admit his crimes and face the consequences. The emperor's desperate attempts to silence everyone who knew the truth had transformed Tibur from a conquered town into a battlefield where truth and power fought for supremacy. Helena's arrest had been swift, but her influence had already spread like ripples across still water, touching every person who had wondered why their resistance felt so righteous, why their suffering seemed so unjust. The old woman's detention in the building's lowest chamber had only confirmed what many had begun to suspect, that their oppressor feared the light of day more than any armed rebellion. Orders for mass arrests flew from the emperor's chambers with the desperate urgency of a drowning man, grasping for anything that might keep him afloat. Livia found herself under house arrest, her crime nothing more than learning truths her brother could not bear to have spoken. General Cassius discovered that loyalty was a complex virtue when the object of that loyalty proved unworthy of the devotion offered. Captain Maximus faced the soldier's ultimate dilemma, whether duty to rank superseded duty to justice itself, the covert operation, to help Selene escape, had been planned with the careful precision that Captain Maximus brought to all military endeavors. Every guard rotation, every moment of vulnerability, every possible route through the administrative building had been mapped and memorized. Yet the true challenge lay not in the physical mechanics of flight, but in creating the illusion that she remained captive, while she moved freely through a town that had become a powder keg, waiting for the spark of truth to ignite it. The window faces east, Maximus explained during one of their carefully orchestrated conversations, his voice pitched low enough to avoid detection by listening ears. At the changing of the guard, there will be 3 minutes when that section of wall is unwatched. But escape means nothing if you have nowhere to run, and nowhere to run means nothing if you cannot rally support for what comes next. Selene's response revealed the transformation that had occurred since her father's death and her own public humiliation. No longer was she the grieving daughter seeking only survival. She had become a leader preparing for a confrontation that would determine not just her fate, but the future of everyone who had suffered under illegitimate rule. "I'm not running," she said, her voice carrying quiet conviction that reminded Maximus of veteran soldiers preparing for battles they knew might be their last. "My father died believing he was fighting tyranny, but he didn't know he was fighting crime itself. This letter changes everything. It makes our resistance not rebellion, but restoration of legitimate authority. The people deserve to know the truth, and Aurelianus deserves to face judgment for his crimes. General, Cassius's agonizing decision to choose between personal loyalty and moral duty reached its crisis point when, ordered to execute prisoners who had committed no crime beyond knowing inconvenient truths. The general had served Rome for 30 years, had followed orders that sent him into impossible battles and political situations that tested every principle he held dear. But this was different. This was not the harsh necessity of maintaining imperial authority, but the desperate attempt of a criminal to cover his tracks with the blood of innocence. The meeting in his private quarters with 3 centurions who shared his doubts revealed the fracture lines running through the Roman forces stationed in Tibur. Professional soldiers could follow orders that served Rome's interests, even when those orders caused personal moral discomfort. But orders that served only to protect a usurper's crimes struck at the foundation of military honor itself. "The men are asking questions," reported Centurion Marcus Flavius, his scarred face grim with the weight of professional concern. "Not openly, not seditiously, but they're wondering why we're arresting old women and teenagers instead of hunting actual rebels." When soldiers begin to doubt the purpose of their orders, discipline follows doubt into chaos. Senator Brutus's manipulation of the unfolding crisis had reached new levels of sophistication as he positioned himself as the voice of reason and legitimate authority. His agents moved through both Roman and local populations, spreading carefully crafted versions of recent revelations that painted him as the Senate's chosen instrument for restoring proper governance. The senator's ambitions had found in Aurelianus's crimes the perfect justification for a power grab that could be presented as patriotic duty. Yet Brutus had underestimated both the complexity of the situation he sought to exploit and the determination of those who refused to trade one form of tyranny for another. His attempt to co-opt local resistance for his own political purposes ran headlong into leaders who had learned to distrust Roman authority regardless of its source or proclaimed legitimacy. Titus's rallying of the resistance forces had transformed from desperate conspiracy into something approaching organized revolution as news of imperial crimes spread through networks that had been built over years of careful preparation. The young man's friendship with Selene had evolved into something larger. He had become the focal point for everyone who sought not just regime change but fundamental transformation of the relationship between ruler and ruled. The resistance meeting held in the ruins of an ancient temple outside town drew representatives from communities across the province, men and women who had traveled dangerous roads to hear first-hand accounts of the letter's revelations. What they learned confirmed their deepest suspicions about Roman rule, while providing the legal and moral framework for actions they had previously justified only through desperation. "We are not rebels," Titus declared to the assembled crowd, his young voice carrying across the moonlit ruins with surprising authority. "We are citizens of Rome demanding that our emperor obey the laws he claims to embody. Claudius Maxentius died for the crime of believing that empires should serve their people rather than consume them. His successor murdered him to prevent reforms that would have made this conversation unnecessary. Emperor Aurelianus's psychological unraveling accelerated, as each attempt to contain the crisis created new problems that threatened to spiral beyond his control. The man who had once managed complex political situations with calculating precision now found himself reacting to events rather than shaping them, always one step behind crises that multiplied faster than they could be suppressed. His confrontation with the captured Helena revealed the depth of his deterioration as past and present collapsed into a single moment of reckoning. The old woman who had nursed him through childhood illnesses looked at him now with eyes that held more disappointment than fear, more sorrow than anger. "I remember the boy you were," she said, her voice carrying across the dungeon chamber with the authority of someone who had nothing left to lose. "Curious, compassionate, troubled by injustice even when it benefited you. That boy would weep to see what you have become, would beg forgiveness for crimes his adult self refuses even to acknowledge." The emperor's response revealed how completely the protective barriers of rationalization had crumbled under the weight of accumulated guilt and present crisis. "That boy was weak," he snarled, his imperial composure shattered beyond repair. "That boy would have let the empire fragment into chaos rather than make the hard choices necessary for survival. I saved Rome from idealistic foolishness that would have destroyed everything our ancestors built." Helena's reply struck with the precision of a blade finding its target. "You saved nothing, child. You only delayed Rome's reckoning with its own contradictions. Empires built on lies eventually fall to truth, and justice delayed is not justice denied. It is justice that arrives with compound interest." Captain Maximus's revelation to his men about the emperor's true nature divided the Roman forces as surely as any military defeat could have accomplished. Half remained loyal to their oaths regardless of personal doubts, while the other half found in the truth about imperial legitimacy permission to follow their consciences rather than their orders. The resulting standoff within the garrison created a military crisis that threatened to spark wider conflict regardless of political developments. Selene's spiritual preparation for what she knew would be the final confrontation with Aurelianus took place in the pre-dawn hours, when the town lay quiet under martial law. Her prayers to Diana mixed appeals for strength with acceptance of whatever fate awaited, seeking not victory, but the courage to face truth's consequences. With the dignity her father had shown in his final moments, the silver pendant around her neck caught the first light of dawn as she prepared for a day that would determine whether justice could triumph over power, whether truth could overcome the lies that held an empire together, and whether one young woman's refusal to surrender could inspire others to demand the freedom that had been stolen from them 15 years ago. As the sun rose over Tibur, every person in the town understood that the coming hours would bring a reckoning that had been building since the night Emperor Claudius Maxentius died with his dreams of reform unfulfilled and his murderer unpunished. The Roman eagle standard that Aurelianus gripped so desperately had become not a symbol of his authority, but a measure of how far he had fallen from the ideals it was meant to represent. The imperial seal ring felt heavier than iron on Emperor Aurelianus's finger as he stood before the assembled crowd in Tibur's main square, its golden surface reflecting the morning sun that would witness either the restoration of his authority or the final collapse of 15 years of illegitimate rule. The signet bore the eagle and thunderbolt of Jupiter, symbols of divine mandate that now felt like accusations against a man who had claimed heaven's blessing through murder and lies. Around him, the town had gathered not from choice, but from the ultimatum that had echoed through the streets since dawn: surrender. The rebel's daughter, or watch everyone die, citizens of Tibur. His voice carried across the stone square, with the practiced authority of a ruler who had addressed armies and senates, yet beneath the imperial command lay tremors of desperation that sharp ears could detect. Your harboring of sedition ends today. The girl who calls herself daughter of Marcus will be delivered to imperial justice, or this entire community will share the fate of traitors. You have until the sun reaches its zenith to decide whether loyalty or destruction marks your choice. The crowd that faced him was different from the terrified assembly that had witnessed Selene's first humiliation. Where once there had been bowed heads and averted eyes, now there were faces raised in defiance. Shoulders squared with the confidence that came from knowing the truth about the man who demanded their submission. The letter's revelations had spread through Tibur like wildfire, transforming the emperor from legitimate authority into common criminal in the space of a single night. Selene's dramatic appearance on the administrative building steps sent a ripple of shock through the assembled crowd as she emerged not as the broken prisoner they had last seen, but as a leader prepared to face whatever consequences truth demanded. The chains that had bound her wrists were gone, replaced by the simple dignity of someone who had chosen her fate rather than having it imposed upon her. The silver pendant of Diana caught the morning light, its goddess image seeming to watch over her faithful daughter in this moment of ultimate trial. "I am here," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the square, despite her youth and the magnitude of the moment she faced. "But I come not as your prisoner, Aurelianus, but as the voice of justice you have tried to silence for 15 years. These people deserve to know the truth about the man who claims to rule them, and the truth about the emperor you murdered to steal his throne." The crowd's reaction was electric, a mixture of shock and vindication that rippled through hundreds of witnesses who had suspected but never known the full extent of their oppressor's crimes. Mothers clutched children closer, while fathers stepped forward protectively, all of them understanding that they were witnessing something that would be remembered and spoken of for generations, the moment when truth faced power and demanded a reckoning. Helena's testimony followed Selene's revelation with the authority of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from speaking truth to power. The old woman's voice, strengthened by years of carrying the burden of knowledge, cut through the morning air like a blade finding its target. She described in careful detail the night of Emperor Claudius's death, the slow poison that had created the appearance of natural causes, and the letter that proved Aurelianus's victims would have lived free under legitimate rule. General Cassius's public defection from the emperor struck like lightning across the assembled Roman forces as the scarred veteran stepped forward to address both his soldiers and the crowd. They had been ordered to suppress. His 30 years of service lent weight to words that might have seemed treasonous from a lesser source, while his reputation for absolute honesty made denial impossible even for those who wished to disbelieve. "I have served 3 emperors," he declared, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had led men through impossible battles and brought them home alive. "I have followed orders that cost me sleep and carried out duties that tested my conscience. But I will not serve a murderer who stole the throne from a better man. And I will not order Roman soldiers to shed innocent blood to protect criminal acts." The armed standoff that followed divided the Roman garrison as surely as if an enemy army had marched between their ranks. Captain Maximus and half the soldiers moved to form a protective barrier around Selene and the townspeople, while the remaining forces struggled with loyalties that had been shattered by revelations too profound to ignore. Swords remained sheathed, but hands rested on hilts, every man understanding that the next few moments would determine not just the fate of a provincial town, but the nature of Roman authority itself. Emperor Aurelianus's rage-filled order to execute Selene immediately revealed the complete breakdown of the calculated ruler who had once managed complex political crises with philosophical precision. The man who had quoted Marcus Aurelius on duty and necessity now screamed commands, driven by nothing more sophisticated than the desperate fury of a cornered animal lashing out at anything within reach. "Kill her!" he shrieked, his voice cracking with the strain of emotions too powerful for imperial composure to contain. "Kill them all! Burn this place to ash, and let the provinces see what happens to those who defy Caesar's will." The refusal of his own officers to obey marked the moment when imperial authority died in Tibur, replaced by something more fundamental: the recognition that legitimate power must serve justice rather than demanding that justice serve power. The funeral pyre that had been prepared for Selene's execution stood in the center of the square, like a monument to imperial excess, its carefully arranged wood and oil waiting for flames that would never come to consume an innocent life. Instead, the structure had become something entirely different, a symbol of the death of the old order and the possibility of redemption rising from the ashes of 15 years of lies. Emperor Aurelianus stared at the pyre with eyes that no longer saw clearly, his mind fracturing under the weight of accumulated guilt and present desperation. His final breakdown came not with dramatic gesture, but with the quiet collapse of a man who had spent years building walls against truth, only to watch them crumble in a single morning. The philosophical justifications, the appeals to necessity, the careful construction of imperial duty, all of it fell away to reveal someone who had lost himself so completely in the pursuit of power that he no longer remembered who he had been before the crown consumed. "Everything else I did what Rome required," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the murmur of the crowd that watched his disintegration with a mixture of fascination and pity. "Claudius would have destroyed everything our ancestors built with his dreams of provincial freedom and shared governance. Someone had to preserve the empire, even if the cost was—" His words trailed off as he confronted the full weight of what that cost had been. The emperor's desperate attempt to maintain power through violence manifested in orders that grew increasingly incoherent as reality crashed against delusion. He commanded the destruction of the entire town, the execution of every witness, the burning of evidence that could never be truly destroyed because it lived in too many hearts and minds to be silenced through force. "Bring the legions!" He screamed at soldiers who no longer moved to obey his commands. "Crucify them all! Let the provinces see what happens to those who forget that Caesar's will is law." But the words echoed emptily in a square where his authority had already died, killed not by rebellion, but by the simple power of truth spoken clearly and without fear. Livia's ultimate sacrifice came as she stepped between her brother and the crowd he sought to destroy, her movement placing her directly in the path of violence that madness might unleash. The gesture was simultaneously personal and political, a sister's attempt to save whatever remained of the man she had once loved, and a Roman citizen's refusal to let imperial power be used to commit mass murder. "Enough," she said, her voice carrying across the square with quiet authority that commanded attention where shouted orders had failed. "You have fallen far enough, brother. Don't let your final act be the slaughter of innocents who seek only the justice you have denied them for 15 years. If there is anything left of the man I knew, let him end this before it consumes what remains of your soul." The moment of horrifying clarity that followed stripped away the last protective barriers Aurelianus had built against self-knowledge. He saw himself as others saw him, not the necessary guardian of Roman greatness, but a common murderer who had dressed his crimes in imperial purple and called them statecraft. The recognition was devastating and complete, leaving him standing before hundreds of witnesses with nothing left to defend except the indefensible. Captain Maximus's protection of Selene in this crucial moment represented more than military duty. It was the choice of a professional soldier to serve justice rather than rank, to defend the innocent rather than protect the guilty. His positioning between the emperor and his intended victims sent a clear message to every person present about where legitimate authority truly resided. The stunning moment when Emperor Aurelianus removed his imperial seal and held it high for all to see marked the death of one era and the potential birth of another. The ring that had represented absolute power now became merely a piece of jewelry, valuable only for the gold and craftsmanship that had gone into its creation. With deliberate ceremony, he let it fall to the stone pavement, where it rang like a bell, announcing the end of illegitimate rule. "I confess," he said, his voice gaining strength as the burden of pretense fell away. "I killed Claudius Maxentius through poison administered over months. I stole the throne that belonged by right to better men. I suppressed his decree that would have granted your people the autonomy they deserved. Everything I have done since has been an attempt to justify that original crime, and every justification has required new crimes until I no longer recognize the man I have become." Senator Brutus's attempt at a coup in the power vacuum that followed the emperor's confession revealed the calculating nature of political ambition that saw opportunity in every crisis. But his bid for control was rejected by General Cassius and the soldiers who had chosen conscience over convenience, demonstrating that legitimacy could not be seized through opportunism. When built on the foundation of acknowledged justice, the emperor's acceptance of his fate and his request for exile rather than execution marked the beginning of possible redemption. For a man who had lost himself in the pursuit of power, Selene's demonstration of mercy in granting that request showed a strength that her captors had never possessed, the ability to choose compassion even for those who had shown none. The symbolic moment when the imperial regalia was consigned to the flames meant to consume an innocent life represented the cleansing fire that could burn away false authority and clear ground for something better to grow. The new Charter of Freedom lay spread across the marble table where imperial decrees had once been signed, its parchment bearing words written in both elegant Latin and the flowing script of the local language. 6 months had passed since the day truth triumphed over tyranny in Tibur's town square, and the document before them represented everything Marcus had died hoping to achieve: formal recognition of provincial autonomy, protection of local customs and governance, and an end to the taxation policies that had driven families into slavery and desperation. Selene traced the carefully inscribed letters with fingers that no longer bore the marks of iron shackles, marveling at how words on parchment could carry more power than all the legions Rome had ever fielded. The charter had been negotiated through months of careful diplomacy, its provisions hammered out in councils that included representatives from across the former empire's provinces. What had begun as one girl's refusal to surrender had grown into a movement that transformed the relationship between ruler and ruled. Throughout the known world, General Cassius had emerged as the natural leader of the transitional government, his reputation for honesty and competence making him acceptable to Romans and provincials alike. The scarred veteran approached his new responsibilities with the same methodical precision he had brought to military campaigns, but guided now by principles of justice rather than mere conquest. His first act had been to establish courts where grievances could be heard without regard to the petitioner's citizenship or wealth. Change comes slowly to institutions built over centuries, he said during one of their weekly councils, his weathered face reflecting the weight of responsibilities he had never sought but could not refuse. But it comes nonetheless when good people refuse to accept that injustice is the natural order of things. Your father would be proud to see his dreams taking root in legislation rather than dying on battlefields. The transformation of Tiber itself spoke to the deeper changes that had rippled outward from that pivotal morning when truth had faced power and emerged victorious. Streets once patrolled by suspicious soldiers now hosted markets where Roman merchants traded as equals with local craftsmen. Children played openly in squares where fear had once muted their laughter, their games echoing off stones that had witnessed both tyranny's peak and its downfall. Captain Maximus's developing relationship with Selene had grown from the mutual respect forged in crisis into something deeper and more lasting. Their conversations now ranged across philosophy and governance, the practical challenges of building new institutions, and the personal growth that came from choosing principle over convenience. His proposal had been as carefully considered as any military operation, delivered in the garden where she often sat reading the letters that arrived from across the provinces. "I offer not protection, for you have proven yourself capable of that," he had said, his soldier's directness softened by genuine affection, "but partnership in whatever future we build together. Your strength has taught me that true courage lies not in the absence of fear, but in doing what is right despite that fear." Livia's work in Rome to reform imperial policies had borne fruit in legislation that limited the power of future emperors and strengthened the rights of provincial citizens. Her brother's confession had provided the moral authority needed to push through changes that previous reformers had died attempting to achieve. The reforms bore Claudius Maxentius's name, finally giving the murdered emperor the legacy he had died trying to create. The exiled Aurelianus lived now in a remote monastery, his days spent in simple labor and contemplation rather than the complex machinations of imperial politics. His letters to Selene, written in the careful script of someone who had rediscovered humility, spoke of genuine remorse and gratitude for the mercy that had saved him from becoming a complete monster. The man who had once commanded legions now tended gardens and copied texts, finding in honest work the peace that absolute power had never provided. "I understand now what Claudius tried to teach me," he had written in his most recent letter. "That strength lies in service rather than dominance, that true authority comes from the consent of the governed rather than the fear of the ruler. You showed me this through your example, and I pray that my remaining years might reflect something of the wisdom you possess so naturally." Titus had grown into a leader whose youthful passion had been tempered by responsibility but not extinguished by compromise. His work in rebuilding the province according to principles of justice and equality had earned him respect among both former rebels and Romans who had learned to see beyond the prejudices of conquest. The forge, where he had once hammered out frustration, now produced tools for construction rather than weapons for war. Old Helena had died peacefully in her sleep 3 months after the truth was revealed, her weathered face showing the satisfaction of someone who had lived to see justice finally served. Her funeral had drawn mourners from across the province, men and women who understood that her courage in speaking truth to power had made all subsequent changes possible. The wisdom she had shared continued to guide the new government through challenges that required patience and principle rather than force. Senator Brutus's trial and conviction in Rome had demonstrated that justice could reach even the most powerful when enough people demanded accountability from their leaders. His networks of corruption and ambition had been exposed and dismantled, replaced by systems designed to prevent the concentration of power that made tyranny possible. The establishment of new laws protecting provincial rights and limiting imperial authority had required careful balance between reform and stability. The changes preserved what was valuable in Roman civilization, while discarding the oppressive elements that had made rebellion inevitable. Local communities gained the right to govern themselves according to their customs, while maintaining access to Roman roads, markets, and legal protections. The symbolic planting of a new tree where the imperial platform once stood had taken place on the anniversary of Marcus's death, its roots reaching deep into soil that had been watered with the blood of those who died for freedom. Selene had spoken at the ceremony, her words carrying across a crowd that included many of the same faces that had witnessed her humiliation months before. "My father died believing that freedom was worth any sacrifice," she had said, her voice strong and clear in the morning air. "Today we plant this tree not just in his memory, but as a promise to future generations, that tyranny need not be endured when good people choose to resist it. Together, the final image of children playing freely in streets once, patrolled by fearful soldiers, captured the essence of what they had achieved together, a world where innocence could flourish without constant vigilance against oppression, where families could build futures without fear that arbitrary power would destroy everything they held dear."